democratize the digital health solutions, allows for awareness and accountability, which is crucial for behavior change and crucial for really combating the chronic disease epidemics that we face. And it really enables a future healthcare delivery, which we believe is about remote delivery and really a focus on preventive care. The important thing to understand about preventive care that it really is about lifestyle intervention, and you have to increase awareness. And the good news is awareness is everywhere for us. We have these tools that tell us whether we're sitting too much, whether we're exercising properly, whether our weight's going up, what we're eating, what we're not eating. And similar to people who, I like to say, who can't keep time well or who are maybe not as prone to being able to be on time, we create a system around accountability for them. They get paid to be at work on time. There's agendas, there's watches, smartphones, alarms. But we don't do that in healthcare. We write off many of our people who are predisposed to chronic disease by just saying, you know what, come to me when you have disease. And so that personalized data really is so critical, and that's where the devices come in. It produces personalized data and increase awareness. But you can't stop there. You have to really give a very clear course, a plan of action, and you have to give constant feedback to really drive better outcomes. So this whole concept about high touch, high tech is really critical if we're going to have digital health impact the problems that we have in society now. And so it's not just about aggregating data, and you can see our platform here as we aggregate data on steps. We have a point system. We've got a physiologic age. We aggregate cholesterol and genetics and trends. But what's really important is that interaction, that feedback from coaches that really can put perspective behind what that data means and create that relationship, which then increases your chance for improved accountability and ultimately better outcomes. And so that's really what we're about at MD Revolution. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you.
So my name is Mark, and I'm the co-founder of Be Close, and some of you may have dropped by earlier here. But before I get started, I just wanted to provide a couple of slides just to give some context to sort of the problem we're solving here. And so actually, if I really want to shout out Dan Monroe here. This is actually borrowed from one of his Forbes pieces, but this really sort of puts the problem in perspective. If you look at this graph here, we're talking about cost in healthcare, right? This is an unsustainable problem. And actually, this particular graph really looks at the cost distribution by age. And so as we look at this, especially for a number of industrialized countries here, in the US, cost, especially post-65, really begins to increase at a staggering rate to the point where, certainly if you're in your 80s, early 80s, you're paying almost $40,000 a year medical cost. And so as we talk about medical reform and sort of reforming reimbursement models and really changing the face of healthcare, we really need to look at where that driver is coming from, and really we need to focus on this particular segment where we can achieve the greatest cost reduction. And so it's really a simple math problem. And so if you sort of boil this all down, the average sort of yearly cost of assisted living is about $40,000. That's typically where people end up. And really the cost after a few years is over $100,000. And so what's really staggering, however, is that the average retirement savings for those people who are just about to enter retirement, 50 to 64 segment in the United States today, $26,000, right? So when I heard that number, I was like, that's got to be wrong. It's order of magnitude off, and it's actually not. So what that means is that people are at a $70,000 caregiving deficit just for assisted living alone. This doesn't include acute care. This includes no other segment of the healthcare spectrum that they're going to ultimately need. And so if you look at just the numbers of people that are going to be entering the system and the fact that really Medicare and Medicaid needs to pick up the cost of that care, the GAO estimated that actual future Medicare promises against all of this need is actually going to be about $36 trillion, right? It's a gaudy number. It's ridiculous. It's multiple of our GDP. It's totally unsustainable. So by the way, for the entrepreneurs in the room, right, if you want to make a gaudy business pitch deck, you can say like 1% of 36 trillion, I'll be like the next Mark Zuckerberg. But the problem is real. It's very real, and that's really the part of what we're trying to achieve here. And so ultimately, if you can just keep people at home, even just a couple of years longer, you can really eat into that deficit, right? So just 2 years buys you about $77,000 of savings, just keeping people at home. And ultimately what that results in is a higher quality of life, lower cost of care, and that really does sort of speak to this notion that we need more tools, more instrumentation, certainly more sensing analytics, and ultimately touch at that home to really promote this new sort of caregiving model.
Thank you both.
Yep.
I think so Earl Bakken, who founded Medtronic, invented the pacemaker, said about 30 years ago, only 20% of healing is linked to the technology I've created. The other 80% is something else. It's human connection, it's spirituality, it's emotional support. So as you think about your technologies and the proliferation of technologies entering the digital space that are working towards patient engagement and interacting with patients at home, how is it that you're going to stand out, and what is it about the human connection factor that is going to differentiate what you're bringing to the market?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start. For me, technology is simply a tool in caregiving, right? If you really boil everything down, ultimately an algorithm is not going to provide you with real caregiving, right? It may provide you with information, it may improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the care that's given, but it's not going to be empathetic, right? Caregiving is a human pursuit, and at the end, I think what people desire is to have that high-touch experience, right? To really know, to feel like they're being cared for. And ultimately, we can talk about whether Vinod Khoshla's idea that potentially physicians will be replaced by algorithms is actually realistic or not. But I think in some sense, there will probably be some sort of caregiver decision support, but at the end of the day, there will be somebody, perhaps a loved one, a professional caregiver, that is ultimately dispensing that care. And so I think it's really important that we view technology in the appropriate context with it, which is that it's a tool. It's really a tool. So.
Yeah, so if you look at the most effective lifestyle intervention program in modern history, you frequently get experts tell you about the diabetes prevention program, which was an NIH-sponsored study that in the 90s that was sponsored as a big study, and they looked at pre-diabetics who were given metformin, commonly used drug that I use in my practice today, versus lifestyle intervention from health coaches, and the lifestyle intervention group blew them away. I mean, it blew the drug away. It was so much more effective that a lot of what we're doing today is in terms of case management is based on that. And so if you look at the key principles, there's really 5 pillars of behavior change, and well, I might not be able to name all of them, but it really comes down to enabling, educating, motivating, guiding, and supporting. And when you look at technology, those are enablers of those 5 key components, 5 pillars, but they're not the pillars themselves. And when you look at all these cool gadgets that are out there, they're created by technologists and people that have an idea about a cool gadget. But ultimately, we have to keep our minds on what is it that we're trying to accomplish with the technology. And so what we're doing is we believe that those 5 pillars are really what the promise of digital health represents. And it's not until we build an ecosystem around providing the enablement, the education, the support, the motivation, that we're going to really be able to see dramatic outcome differences that we need to see in order to really deal with the problem that we have.
As you're working with the healthcare system and trying to actually get some traction with your technologies, what are some of the biggest barriers that you're facing right now?
I think one of them is that if you look at the types of people that are in healthcare and the types of people that sort of gravitate toward technology, we have inherently different metabolisms, and it's actually for a good reason, right? So oftentimes, I'm a technologist myself, and my greatest fear is missing out on upside, right? There's this great wave of technology that's being pushed into healthcare. Geez, I want to catch that wave. I want to surf it all the way in. And for clinicians and for hospital administrators, really the idea is, we want to mitigate downside risk, right? You want to protect the patient. There is a reason that the FDA exists. There's a reason why those sort of regulations and the protocols that are in place are really important. And so we really, with those 2 different metabolisms, it's really often challenging to craft solutions that sort of match up with the types of people that are attacking them. I love the presentation yesterday, certainly with Jeff Clapp, talking about sort of his frustration in working with Mayo. And oftentimes, I think many technologists feel that frustration, but I think at the end of the day, we realize that it is for a good purpose. And so in terms of just challenges, certainly that's one of the large challenges. The second one I wanted to highlight was the fact that operationalizing technology into healthcare is oftentimes overlooked, right? So Adam Darkins of the VA has talked about this quite a bit. It's not so much that it's the challenge of finding a technology that's perhaps appropriate for solving a problem. The real problem is sort of getting that into the homes of people, getting it even just used, compliance, sort of getting devices serviced, right? So that operations piece certainly should not be overlooked. And for small businesses in particular that are dealing with health devices or even sort of large-scale rollouts, it oftentimes can be very restrictive. So really picking the right partners, really thinking through that operations plan, and really thinking through the care model that you're trying to push into place is important.
You get to see a little bit of both sides of it from where you sit. So what's your?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you look at the medical profession as a whole, we've always lacked plasticity when it comes to adopting new technologies. I mean, the average, and there's a lot of data to support the average number of years for a new technology to get adopted into practice is about 17 years. You take BRCA testing for breast cancer and ovarian cancer. It was discovered in '91. It wasn't until late 2000s that doctors really started using it. So the good news is that with healthcare reform, the incentives now are finally aligned where physicians can no longer practice in this kind of fee-for-service, more is better type system. So we have to look for more novel ways to actually deliver greater value as physicians. So that's helping, but on your point, we really have to start looking at the early adopters and the innovators. And there's more of them today because of the economics than there have been in the past in terms of people willing to try new things. And so you have to really realize that you're not going to be marketing your technology to the masses, because if you are, you're going to fail. You have to really find the early adopters, the innovators that can move quickly and can go out and prove out the use cases that need to be proven in order for a rapid and kind of mass adoption to take place.
My favorite story that is representative of, I think, the mindset of many who are chief executive officers, chief nursing officers, chief medical officers in healthcare is we held a Twitter contest at one of our events. We were giving away a Nest, and nobody was on Twitter, and somebody came up to us with a tweet written on a piece of paper and said, "Could you tweet this for us?" I mean, the savvy isn't there to even have the appetite for some of these technologies quite yet. As you look at some of the stories that have been captured through the use of your technology, is there a particularly compelling story that tells how the human factor has enabled, inherence, relationship that ultimately enabled better outcomes?
Yeah, so I have a few stories actually, and I think they're more use cases than stories. So one that's particularly interesting, when we set out to form BClose, we thought, well, geez, this is going to be a caregiver engagement tool for primarily families, right? So this will be something where perhaps if you have a mom that's aging, you just want to check in, you could sort of get that comfort, that peace of mind, knowing that everything was okay. But we started to realize very quickly that the group of stakeholders that potentially could benefit from our platform were much larger than we had originally envisioned. And so in an early study, we actually went to Canada and to New Brunswick in particular, and we worked with the Ministry of Health in New Brunswick. And what they were particularly interested in was they were actually trying to figure out, well, we've got this massive problem. I showed the slide earlier of the dramatic cost increase with age, but they said we have an aging population here. We're a fairly small province, and we're really trying to save some money here, but still continue to care for people. And so we pushed this sort of ambitious vision that took a little bit of guts on their part to implement, but really what it was actually pushing more care into the home. And so on the surface, that looked like, well, Jesus is a big investment for us, it's a big risk. But the idea was to use the analytics that were gained from the home, like the sensing that we provide through BClose, and ultimately push that to the decision makers centrally, and then to dispatch home care workers, home health aides, and whatnot into homes to ultimately head off problems before they became very expensive. And in that trial, which was a large government-funded trial, very early on, it was discovered that by actually spending just a little bit extra money, by putting more people in the home, the government was saving about $1,200 a month per person that they were caring for. And so what that enabled them to do was to make that program a little bit larger, to ultimately scale the program and help a lot more people. So they cut off the study about halfway through, and we thought, oh, geez, this is a problem. And that was actually, the news was that they were going to fully reimburse this if patients met a set of qualifying criteria. So to our knowledge, that was sort of one of the first programs that really demonstrated value by pushing more care into the home and then ultimately resulting in reimbursements. That's one example. A second example I'll highlight is actually we were working through a Medicaid waiver program in the state of Missouri. So the state of Missouri was caring for people with cognitive impairment, and these people had various problems in terms of their activities of daily living. And so they were putting actual people, caregivers that were state-sponsored caregivers, into these group homes, and they were living with these cognitively impaired people 24 hours a day. So very costly proposition, right? And they were still unable to care for all the people that they really needed to care for through this program. So they we worked with them to actually scale the program a bit. So we said, why don't we take that caregiver out of the home in the hours where we feel it's not quite as risky to not have a caregiver there, and we'll provide the depth of analytics, the depth of sort of reporting about what's happening in that home. So if there is a problem, we could dispatch a caregiver from a remote location. And ultimately, we can reduce some of the care burden, the cost of this program, and allow you to scale the program statewide. And essentially, that's what's happened. And so that Medicaid waiver program is now scaling across the state of Missouri. And actually, we've gotten great results in terms of providing better quality of care, certainly reducing the care burden, and ultimately providing more timely response. So.
Yeah, so, you know, it's interesting when you take your average patient who is seeking care from their primary care physician, you know, or a cardiologist like myself, we typically, you know, spend about 30 seconds on talking about, you know, what they need to do, and usually it's like eat right, exercise, and you know, you go about your way, they go about your way, and you know, you see them back 6 months again, you know, later, and you know, you wonder why they didn't listen. Well, it's really interesting because what digital health allows us to do, and what we've seen time and time again, and countless stories of people, when you look at, let's say, 10 people on average with either on track to have chronic disease or have risk factors for chronic disease, 3 out of 10 don't care. I mean, they really don't, you know. But the 7 out of 10 really do care. But they've not been given the tools, nor have they been given any kind of consistent, real-time advice around what to do and whether what they're doing is actually what they need to be doing. And so what's really profound about what we've seen since deploying this model is that those 7 out of 10 people come back and say, this has changed my life because for the first time I have the tools to do something about it. And I can actually know what I need to do. And so it's really just as simple as them now being aware of what they need to be doing and having a relationship to actually, you know, create an accountability kind of loop where they can continue to do these things that they know are now healthy. So it's really about, you know, wow, I wish I had this 20 years earlier. And so we're seeing, you know, not only the patients, but their husbands and their kids starting to do things that are really transforming, you know, their lives. And we have, you know, example after example of you know, husbands that lose weight with the wives and kids that are now doing things. So that's really where it stems, you know, to me, the transformative stories surround the fact that, wow, I actually am in control, you know, and that's something that is surprising for a lot of people, especially those that have risk factors, because those like us might pick up, you know, the things on our own, or we might be in that space so we understand what we need to do, but those that we really need the most help are not getting it.
Given how critical that human factor is to the success of both of your technologies, have either of you looked at or explored professional services? You know, are you training coaches? What are you doing to help make sure that that human factor is actually effective in supporting the technology side?
I think one of the important things is to really think through what you're doing, right? So yesterday, I think Jeff Clapp again mentioned the best thing is that if you're not really solving a problem, right, you're not really in the conversation. So ultimately, you have to be solving some pain point in the caregiving loop, and you ultimately have to think through how are we providing a feedback loop of care that ultimately makes sense. It reduces costs, it improves outcomes, and it provides perhaps even a decreased caregiving burden, right? Because that's ultimately what's important for these programs to scale. And so another sort of use case here for us, we worked through a Medicare innovation grant in the state of Kansas. And ultimately what we were trying to do was to pair a Coleman care transition plan against sort of the technology that we were deploying. So really it was all about sort of going through the design thinking process, really, you know, sort of build, measure, learn, right? So, and really providing empathy at the front end of that, sitting down with the people who are on the front line of care, really trying to understand how they dispense care and how technology could help them. Because when you do that, you very quickly start to see where their pain points are.
Now, have you packaged sort of what you've learned from that so that you can scale it each time you deploy your technology?
Right, scale is a whole different problem,
Yeah.
right? So I think the industry in general, we need to sort of push past pilots, and I know that's a topic that we'll probably discuss later, but ultimately, yes, I think that's where we need to be, is to get this to a point where we can almost franchise these care models, or to make them packaged so that we can deploy them across, you know, multiple health systems, because the learnings that we gain from each one of these pilots is incredibly informative for people who are, you know, perhaps a little bit less behind the curve. So.
Yeah, so we have our own coaches. We have a scalable coach method. We're working with American Council on Exercise, which is the largest certifying body in the country for fitness professionals. They have 50,000, 10,000 sit for the boards, and so they are actually building a RevUp certification program, which we're going to co-market for fitness professionals to get trained on the way we actually coach. So, yeah, the answer to that is absolutely.
All right. What about some of your greatest challenges or failures that you've faced since getting off the ground, and what have been some of the bumps in having this blended model?
I think we're, all of us that are sort of in this space right now are just a bit early, right? And that's great because we can sort of set the direction that this industry is going to go, but that also means we're going to carry a few arrows in our back. And I think sometimes it's just being selective about the opportunities that you pursue. And sort of as a startup, you're just enthusiastic to try to work with almost anybody, right? And oftentimes that means finding perhaps not the best fit for your technology. So I think one of the bumps that we've experienced in the past is picking opportunities that are maybe not quite aligned with the value that our product provides. And so really being selective about the partners that you choose and ensuring that those partners share the same vision in terms of their ultimate goals, right? And then finally, sort of operationalizing these programs, really thinking through what are the logistics challenges to getting these systems into the field, to ultimately supporting these systems, and to promoting patient adoption and patient stickiness. And so, there's no right answers to any of these. And one of the things that I heard yesterday was that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Almost every deal that we encounter, we have to do some sort of customization. And again, as a technologist, that's difficult for me to sort of oftentimes rationalize because I'd like to create a platform, right, create a broad scalability with sort of a very flexible inner fabric. And that's what you have to do that. But on the fringes, you certainly have to do quite a bit of customization of your solution to meet the needs of various sort of constituents.
Yeah, so the challenges are, multiple. You've got, we're everyththing from the ability to have stable APIs from the different devices to finding the right partners. This is a new space, and we're not only creating a product, but we're creating a market, right? So the biggest challenge for a platform like ours is that you're essentially creating the market while at the same time creating the product, creating the service. So it's challenging. So you got to make sure you have the right people, the right investors, the right partners, and the right support network, and you have to be smart about who you partner with for that reason. And so those are really the biggest challenges, is really, creating that market and being really clear and pithy and incisive about how you describe your product and what you do.
You mentioned the challenge of getting past pilots and scaling up after you get sort of the initial bite, as the case may be.
Right.
What has been some of your thoughts on how others can achieve that, or where you're going forward?
And I think part of what some of the theme that I heard, at least in this panel, is just this notion of feedback, right? And I know you mentioned it as well. And so really sort of our thought on this is that for these healthcare models to really scale, we need to think about multiple nested feedback loops. And I think we are all talking about that in some sense. So the idea that there's sort of patient feedback, right? So the idea of quantified self and really trying to care for yourself. And ultimately, products like ours provide sort of caregiver-assisted feedback. So and then there's sort of multiple layers of this, ultimately culminating in clinician-assisted feedback. So the more care that we can actually push up towards the patient, perhaps even the caregivers of those patients, we can get greater scale with all these sort of technologies. So I think as we're thinking about moving past pilots, we need to be realistic about how we decrease burden on the healthcare system, not necessarily increase burden, right? So with all this data and this knowledge, we can't just pump that to the healthcare system and hope for the best, right? We have to be very thoughtful about how we create intervention programs, even the types of sort of analytics that we're providing. So everyone's mentioning predictive analytics and artificial intelligence. Really, what is the end goal of that, right? It's ultimately to improve outcomes, decrease care costs, and hopefully reduce some of the burden on the healthcare system. So I think part of the challenge for us, just as technologists, is to think through what is actually the solution that we're providing? Does this meet a set of criteria that's realistic? And ultimately, are we solving the right problems here?
So as as we're coming to the close of the panel, as you think about what are the top 3 things that you would share with others as advice for how to manage the technology with the human factor involved, what lessons might you have to share with others?
Yeah, so I think, so you're saying for other people, companies?
For other people who are taking on technologies, who are trying to blend the two.
Yeah, so I think, again, it goes back to kind of what I started with, which is it's not about the technology. It's really about the outcome you're trying to impact, right? So aligning yourself with people that know the space, right? And I think that the space is littered with people who think they know it, but you're talking about one of the most regulated markets after, nuclear power in the country, right? So, really aligning yourself with people that understand the regulatory hurdles, the culture around making an impact, understanding the culture, what you're trying to change, what the existing culture is, and then really understanding ultimately what you're trying to achieve with your technology or product. And I think that if you are able to do that piece, or those pieces, then I think you're much more likely to be successful as a company in this space. And I think if you're not, then you're going to find out that you're going to be crowded out by a lot of people who are claim to be doing the same exact thing that you're doing. And ultimately, the real companies are going to get weeded out. I mean, they're going to manifest. And in 3-5 years from now, a lot of the companies that we see now are not going to be around. And because they're not doing those things. And I think that what we focus on as a company is exactly that, is like, what is the impact we're really trying to make? And how can we best demonstrate that impact by validation studies, working with academic centers, working with, doing proper conducted research on it, making sure that your claims are right, making sure you're partnering with the right organizations. And I think those are the organizations will stand the test of time.
And for me, it's really about being empathetic, right? So get out of the office and get into the field, right? So that's the number one thing I think we've learned, is that you can't just sit back in an office and think that you can sort of create a new model for care without actually being on the front line, right, and seeing the pain points in action. So one of the decisions that we made early on as a company was to do direct interfacing with some of our early customers. In fact, and this seems like a terrible idea, but it actually worked out okay. We had some of our software engineers talking to customers. So, that gives them a renewed perspective. It gives them sort of the sense that this is a very real problem that we're solving, that the user experience is critically important, that we're trying to solve, problems that extend beyond a single stakeholder. There are multiple stakeholders in this problem, and that the problem is very real. So I think getting out of the office gives you that perspective, getting into the field, interfacing with the people that you're helping, really sorts to tune in what your solution is providing. And I think at the end of the day, that results in sort of a much higher quality product.
I think a great ending point. I think all too seldom the engineers and the people developing the product are actually seeing the interactions happen. And you got to put the human factor in there. So thank you both for sharing your thoughts and expertise.
Thank you.